political stability. One interpretation of this is that as the years of practice of democracy, as you clock up more years, institutions will become stronger. But my sense is that it is not about the number of years of democracy that you practice. It is about the inherent character of the type of democracy that we practice, and those who control that state and those who run that system of democracy. In other words, I argue that it is intrinsic in the character of that class to use identities in particular to divide the people. So it doesn't matter how many years we practice this democracy. We are still going to have ethnic parties, we are still going to have politicians divide the people along the lines of identity. Fourth, in spite of these weaknesses, however, I also see appreciable gains in the practice of electoral democracy compared to when we started. Basic political rights, I think, have vastly improved in many countries, particularly so with elections. From no elections at all in the middle to the late 1980s, the vast majority of African countries are now conducting regular elections. Many of them are judged of acceptable quality by the international community. Concomitantly, overall, the quality of transitions after elections seems to be improving as well. Looking back, the early periods of the present practice of electoral democracy saw a prevalence of weak democratic institutions and strong individuals who ran them. Some of them were former military leaders who changed into civilian presidents. Indeed, strong men regularly outlived democratic institutions, as one elected leader after another in Africa openly rejected electoral outcomes and sought to modify electoral rules to remain in power or to abolish the rules altogether. From Zimbabwe to South Africa, Nigeria to Senegal, attempts at constitution fiddling to elongate tenures were rife at a point. That seems to have largely subsided, and transitions, even from incumbents to opposition political parties at presidential elections, have now occurred in a number of countries. Of course, Ghana, Nigeria, etc. In fact, it is becoming somewhat of a paradox that several contentious elections in Africa have yielded legitimate outcomes, and even the most reluctant incumbents have had to give up power. But this is not to say that we're out of the woods yet. It is not all African presidents, it is still not the case that everywhere term limits or tenure elongation is completely eliminated. Recent events in Burundi and the resistance to tenure limits by some West African presidents suggest that we still have quite a way to go. Fifth, Africa's young population is producing what I call an electoral mixed blessings. Elections in Africa are becoming increasingly youthful, although they continue to produce old men as leaders. Young people have become increasingly involved in elections, particularly through new technologies being applied to elections. Social media has become a lasting component of elections and therefore has strengthened the role of young people in elections. Social media is therefore creating new channels of participation that are favored by young people. Practically, all political parties and candidates now have social media accounts which essentially target young voters. But on the con side, however, social media has been widely used to incite hatred during elections or to announce fabricated results which have been linked to post-election violence. Also, the rising problem of youth unemployment has meant that many young people are available for mobilization, to serve electoral violence by politicians. Therefore, social media has contributed to both the expansion of participation and they've become a veritable instrument for mobilizing for electoral violence and disseminating hate speech, particularly ethnic anger during elections. The growing importance of young people in Africa's election has indeed been a mixed blessings. Like social media, I think that traditional media is also playing a mixed role in African elections. Their positive role in voter education, in dissemination of information about elections, and providing platforms for political parties to sell their positions to the electorate has been matched by a divisive role that has conduced violence. In the latter case, what has become clear is the failure of statutory regulatory mechanisms to stop the media from playing this very negative role. Sixth, there has been a rising role of civil society in the electoral process, especially regarding support to electoral administration, voter education, and electoral accountability. In the first instance, civil groups in Africa are becoming a major source of knowledge available to EMBs on diverse issues of electoral administration. Civil society organizations also provide one other type of support to EMBs, which is serving as a line of defense against undue pressure by government. But secondly, I think that civil groups have also been very active in educating voters and ensuring higher turnouts at the elections. Finally, CSOs have been very important in what may be broadly called electoral accountability, especially as entrenched in election observation or monitoring. As we all know, the numbers of local and international observers of African elections has been growing in leaps and bounds. In the process, African elections are contributing to framing a global normative framework for election observation and election administration generally. Seventh, the proliferation of political parties is fast becoming a hallmark of electoral democracy in Africa. In the absence in many countries of independent candidature, political parties have tended to mushroom. This has been the case even in single-member constituency running the simple plurality, that is first past the post electoral systems. Large numbers of political parties tend to be sustained in proportional representation system because of allocation of seats based on votes won. Why this is not necessarily bad why the proliferation of parties is not necessarily bad for democracy. After all, we are practicing multi-party democracy. It points to structural issues in African political parties. 8 is the rising role of the judiciary in determining electoral outcomes. Almost routinely, election results across Africa end up in courts. In Nigeria, with the exception of the 2015 presidential elections, all other presidential elections have been challenged in courts. In Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria, among others, Supreme Courts have had the final say in determining electoral outcomes. And in Nigeria, which I came to know very well, nearly 1,800 post-election cases were handled in 2003 and 2007. I think the rise in judicial intervention in elections is both positive and negative. On the positive side, it is probably a reflection of the willingness of politicians to resolve electoral disputes without recourse to violence. But unfortunately, on the negative side, it reflects the deep-seated inability of politicians to respect party rules. The danger remains the probability that at some point, court decisions will be rejected and clubs will become trumps, to borrow from Thomas Hobbes. Tenth, there is also a growing body of best practices on election in Africa. Some of them have had to do with the work of civil society and others to do with the work of election management bodies. Among the contributions of civil society organizations in this regard include the establishment of accepted standards for election observation, the widespread use of situation rooms, and more recently, the electronic tracking of election promises. So now you read about the Buhari meter in Nigeria, the Maki meter in Senegal, and the Presi meter in Burkina Faso. But in terms of the contribution of EMBs in this regard, I think that what is becoming increasingly accepted, it is becoming increasingly accepted that the use of ICT in election management, which ranges from biometric registration through electronic accreditation and voting, somehow represents best practice. The work of international IDEA in the area of election risk management tools is also worth mentioning. These best practices in election management are spread by increasing knowledge sharing among African EMBs. Issue in African electoral democracy, namely the critical role that international solidarity is playing in African elections. In this context, two things I believe stand out. The first is the emergence of global, regional, and sub-regional standards and mechanisms on electoral democracy and government. The African peer review mechanisms are worth noting. At the sub-regional level of ECOWAS, the last 25 years, ECOWAS has taken bold steps to set strong standards and democratic governance. The declaration of political principles, the revised ECOWAS treaty, and the several protocols of management all show a determined effort by ECOWAS to deal with the issue of democracy, create a framework on which we can continue to build on multi-party democracy. That I would also like to mention is the role of electoral support. Both at the bilateral and multilateral levels, there has been a great support for Africa's electoral democracy by the international community. The joint donor baskets, for example, have become certainly important mechanisms in Africa's progress in electoral democracy. In conclusion, I think that electoral democracy in Africa still has a long way to go to achieve the aspirations, the democratic aspirations of Africa's people. And there are four critical areas for me in which it is seriously challenged if it will be able to do so. The first is the quality of citizenship that it's able to deliver. What does being a citizen under electoral democracy in Africa deliver to you? Does your citizenship deliver jobs, good health, clean water, and freedom to practice your religion? Or does it deliver Or does it deliver state violence, poverty, oppression, and the big man syndrome? The challenge confronting electoral democracy in Africa is to deliver real political participation and popular economic well-being. It has not done so. Second is the quality of institutions and rules. In spite of episodic progress, some of which I have tried to account for, under the watch of the petit bourgeoisie, I think governance institutions, particularly democratic institutions, have generally remained weak in Africa. Also, the proclivity of people in power to undermine institutions and rules remains a major challenge to electoral democracy. But I think the important connection that we have not often made is to show how this is so deeply rooted in the class instincts of the petit bourgeoisie. The future of electoral democracy in Africa, in my opinion, will depend to a large extent to the capacity of citizens, backed by international solidarity, to compel this class to respect rules, grow institutions, and particularly respect democratic rules and election management bodies, the judiciary, as well as political parties. Third is the quality of participation and representation. Participation and representation clearly is an important element in the democratic system. But popular participation in choosing representatives is the heart of political theory. Consequently, how they are treated will be critical to the future of democracy in Africa. And I think central to this will be elections. Notwithstanding the progress that we have seen, the quality of elections conducted in many African countries remains a major cause for concern. In the first place, these elections are essentially zero-sum, winner-take-all in nature, prompting a do-or-die mindset to elections. And this has been conducive to instability. Second, electoral fraud persists in many countries as part of this must-win mentality. This primitive accumulation of votes, I think, is very consistent with the class that controls power in Africa. Third, petit bourgeois ideology has emptied political parties of their inherent value of providing alternative platforms from which voters may choose. Indeed, what we have is what Aki has already said, and which Bayo already made mention of this morning, that we vote without actually choosing. Therefore, going forward, the quality of electoral democracy in Africa will depend a lot on reforming, reforming this system, and particularly, in my opinion, moving attention, moving from focusing attention exclusively on national election to focusing attention as well to on local elections. Because I think that it's really in local elections that people can genuinely, express their democratic choices, since government is closest to them at that level. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, is the quality of accountability and redress that electoral democracy in Africa offers. How accountable are political office holders and leaders? Do citizens feel that they can hold their leaders to account? And I think that accountability entails two things. One is that leaders must be responsive to the wishes of those who elect them. And secondly, they must be responsible. They must act responsibly. And that is to say that those they represent, they must act in a way that, that reflects the demands of those they represent, and perhaps more importantly, they must act within clear rules and institutional frameworks. Thank you very much for listening through my punishment. The opening remarks decided to be keynote speeches, and in retaliation, I was hoping that you sit through my long lecture, but all the same, I hope that within all the rambling, that you would have picked up a couple of things that will help you in the next couple of days to grapple with these very weighty issues that confront African democracy at this time. Thank you very much.
Bajos Kazembe to chair the first panel.
And I enjoy organizing and managing elections. I would like to think everybody who is a commissioner somewhere enjoys that. Of course, properly organized and undertaken. It is my pleasure. First, I would like to thank the organizers who invited me in my individual capacity to come and engage in this. I love this. My background is political science, and so I love engaging with political scientists of whatever nature, liberal, reactionary, or progressive. It is my pleasure now. Oh, thank you very much. It used to be called presidential height. Delivering their papers. To begin with, we have His Excellency Mr. Jose Brito, the former minister in Cape Verde, Foreign Affairs, Policy, and Economic Economic Planning. And currently, he is the founder partner of Tobe, a technological firm for innovation in Africa, and also, of course, is the chairperson. I use chairperson, thank you. Chairperson of the West African Institute. You are welcome. And you have no liberty beyond 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
In French or in Portuguese? French, and in this case.
Just a minute,
Yes. J'ai beaucoup de savoir comment je vais, sur quel point aborder le problème. Je vais l'aborder de façon, disons, qui est le plus facile. C'est parler du futur. Comme on dit, dans le futur, il y a moins de compétition. À présent, il y en a trop. Donc, je pense que nous avons entendu déjà beaucoup d'interventions qui nous donnent une idée des tendances générales existantes sur le processus d'élection en Afrique. Je vais commencer par faire une petite analyse, disons, sur les principaux acteurs de ces élections, disons, l'évolution des tendances de ces électeurs. Premièrement, par les électeurs eux-mêmes. Les électeurs eux-mêmes qui changent. On parle de plus en plus de jeunes, mais on note des changements structurels qui sont en train de se réaliser et que non seulement la jeunesse, mais le fait que de plus en plus les électeurs ne s'identifient plus aux partis politiques. C'est un phénomène mondial, et pas seulement africain, mais de plus en plus on sent que les partis politiques n'intéressent presque plus, disons, les électeurs, au moins ne répondent pas à leurs besoins. Et ce qu'on vérifie de plus en plus, c'est l'augmentation des, ce qu'on peut appeler des électeurs indépendants, des partis. Floating voters, sont ceux qui finalement pourront décider des résultats des élections. Dans le cas du Cap-Vert, en les dernières élections 2011, on avait un sondage évalué que ce nombre d'électeurs indépendants était de 38%, c'est-à-dire qu'ils n'étaient pour aucun parti en lice. Dans les dernières élections, ils étaient de 64%. Donc ça veut dire plus de 2/3 des électeurs ne se sentent pas liés à un parti. Donc ça veut dire que les résultats des élections vont dépendre de ces électeurs. Et toute la compétition électorale va dépendre de la capacité de mobiliser ces électeurs indépendants, qui sont ceux qui feront les abstentionnistes, mais ce sont ceux qui vont décider des résultats des élections. Mais cette évolution, on le voit aussi dans le cadre des électeurs qui s'enregistrent. De moins en moins, quand on regarde que la population en âge de voter augmente, en même temps, ceux qui s'enregistrent n'augmentent pas autant. Donc il y a de plus en plus de gens qui restent en dehors de la compétition électorale. Mais ce que l'on ressent aussi chez les électeurs, c'est que les performances du gouvernement comptent. Government performance matters. Pourquoi? De plus en plus, à cause évidemment que les électeurs sont de plus en plus informés, ils évaluent aussi la performance de la gouvernance et donc est de plus en plus indépendant. Et pour pouvoir faire des votes plus conscients. Il y a évidemment une évolution aussi même dans les votes ethniques. Le nation building se développe de plus en plus en Afrique, quoi qu'on en dise, surtout dans les capitales où on retrouve tout le monde ensemble, disons, où la nation se retrouve. Donc les votes ethniques diminuent aussi. Donc il y a un grand changement sur le comportement des électeurs et sur l'évolution des électeurs. Il y a aussi au niveau des partis des changements. Ce que nous notons, c'est un affaiblissement aussi des partis qui sont là depuis très longtemps. On sent que ce n'est plus la même chose. Peut-être à cause du problème des élites politiques qui sont en train de changer, mais il y a un changement réel de ces partis, très souvent de l'indépendance, et qui ont suivi l'indépendance, ou qui dominent, les partis dominants. Le rôle de ces partis dominants est en train d'être réduit actuellement. Il y a en même temps, et on soit de l'autre côté, une augmentation des partis d'opposition, c'est-à-dire une fragmentation de l'opposition, qui est aussi un phénomène qui répond aux changements qui s'opèrent dans les pays. Disons, d'un côté, l'affaiblissement des partis dominants, et de l'autre côté, l'opposition divisée, fragmentée, qui se développe. Il y a aussi dans les acteurs externes qui ont aussi un rôle dans les résultats. Ces acteurs externes, nous en avons parlé, M. Bouchi en a parlé sur la finance internationale, le fait que finalement, ceux qui décident de ce que nos gens qui seront élus vont faire ne sont pas chez nous. Et on sent de plus en plus cette intervention, non seulement en Afrique, c'est un phénomène global, mais beaucoup plus fort en Afrique parce que nous n'avons pas de contrepoint, disons, à ceux-là qui sont en train de diriger le monde et qui nous imposent, du moins leur point de vue, surtout du point de vue économique, ce que nous devons faire. Mais en même temps, on continue avec toutes ces interventions, soit de l'ancien pouvoir colonial, soit d'autres pays avec des intérêts bien précis. On parle de l'indépendance, mais on pose des questions, disons, sur cette indépendance. Il y a de plus en plus donc l'intervention des organisations régionales, la CEDEAO par exemple, qui commence à être un acteur et qui intervient aussi de plus en plus dans le processus électoral et surgit depuis peu de temps donc, les organisations de société civile au niveau panafricain. On a déjà vu des interventions de l'organisation de société civile d'un pays qui vient dans un autre pays apporter, disons, leur contribution aussi au processus. Donc nous voyons que tout est en train de changer. Donc je parlerai plutôt maintenant, on devrait penser au quatrième mouvement, au quatrième loi de la démocratie qui est en train de se préparer. C'est-à-dire que tout le contexte est en train de se préparer. Mais en même temps, l'un des éléments essentiels de tout cela, ce sont les campagnes électorales, qui changent complètement. Ces campagnes électorales changent. Et elles changent et deviennent de plus en plus chères. Le coût des campagnes électorales fait que beaucoup de gens qui ont de bonnes idées, et c'est ça le problème de la démocratie, elle n'est pas faite pour choisir les meilleurs. La démocratie, elle est faite pour choisir ceux qui peuvent payer et qui sont plus capables de passer leurs idées. On le voit partout, ce n'est pas un phénomène africain, mais en Afrique, ça devient un problème très préoccupant parce que les partis n'ont pas d'argent très souvent, souvent les partis d'opposition n'ont pas la capacité financière d'être en compétition avec les partis au pouvoir. Et ça effectivement change complètement les données du problème. Quand il paraît que les élections ici au Nigeria ont coûté plus d'1 milliard de dollars, en fait, difficile à imaginer, mais ce sont des coûts énormes. Et ce n'est pas du coût officiel, mais du coût, disons, que les partis dépensent pour faire les élections. Et ça a une implication directe sur la gouvernance du pays. Parce que le parti qui est au pouvoir a tendance à vouloir garder, disons, à trouver l'argent en utilisant, disons, l'État. Mais en même temps, notre phénomène qui est en train de se passer, c'est l'introduction de l'argent illicite, au lieu de la drogue. C'est en train d'aller en Afrique, un peu partout, et qui vont influencer les résultats. Donc, il y a ces phénomènes-là qui sont absolument, qui sont en train de complètement changer les données. Et cette question du financement, on n'en parle pas assez. C'est un problème dans lequel on doit essayer de regarder pourquoi. Au Cap-Vert, par exemple, on a essayé de résoudre ce problème où l'État finance les partis. L'État finance les partis, c'est le nombre de votes. Un vote, ça coûte $1, $2, je ne sais pas, pour chaque vote. Et dépendant du nombre de votes du parti, il recevra l'argent. Ce qui amène que le parti doit aller à la banque parce qu'il sait, bon, il sait plus ou moins ce qu'il peut faire et va chercher les prêts pour faire financer sa campagne. C'est pas suffisant, mais il y a beaucoup encore à faire. Donc, bon, malheureusement, il passe très vite. Je voulais surtout aussi après parler d'un changement qu'il y a sur le point de vue technologique, disons, et qui est un élément essentiel. Actuellement, c'est ce que je fais actuellement, essayer justement d'utiliser de nouvelles technologies pour...
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for the presentation. We're sorry that...
Yes, Institute for Democratic Governance.
Yes, thank you very much. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. A few comments, and is it still morning? Good afternoon to all of you. It's indeed my pleasure to be here and also to see some of the usual topics. You've had 3 keynote addresses. I missed most of them, so I may be a bit wayward not speaking to those issues. But I think the topic merits some reflection and probably help us see what the future of democracy is like in Africa. I would like to speak on 4 issues. One is what I call the paradox of electoral democracy in Africa. The second, I will talk about weak accountable government. and what it is doing to the future of democracy. The third I would speak of as political parties and their predatory behavior, which is like they came to restore the process of developing a capitalist society in Africa. 4, nation building, and 5, international commitment to our democracy, which to my mind is weakening, and we don't seem to have any clues of taking responsibility for our democratic development. The first, it is true that the last 2 decades or 3 has been the period that we've seen greater democratic stability, multi-party politics, and elections, and so on. Turnout in African elections are legendary. If you talk to the Europeans and the Americans, many have asked me, how come that in Ghana, for your presidential and parliamentary elections, you have an average turnout of about 80% in the last 24 years. But only half of this is registered or recorded for local government elections. And you would assume that, given our background, military coups, revolutions, one-party states, quite a good package of authoritarian rulers and so on, and the threat of violence have been involved or getting involved in managing peaceful elections. If you look at what happens in Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria last year, ensuring that elections are peaceful is like mobilizing totally for war. It's just that it's for peace. Okay? Just to get parties to comply with the rules of the game, but also to prevail on parties not to resort to violence if they feel cheated. And going to the Supreme Court has been what sometimes they are compelled to do because of the social pressures. And I think it's unusual because you might think that if we are becoming more accustomed to democratic rule and accepting the rules and the values and the norms of democracy, violence, a resort to political violence and so on will be weaker because we may work through the institutions, which is the essence of the rule of law. But there is such deep mistrust towards the institutions, there is such deep mistrust towards just a sense of, or their capacity to ensure justice and protect freedoms. And the parties themselves have such limited commitment to them that the electoral process is full of threats of violence, just in case things don't work out well. So if you look at the cost, the total mobilization of security forces, civil society, churches, mosques, you know, it's like fighting on both the temporal and the spiritual. There are lots of prayers. It goes on unceasingly, you know, and sometimes only for us to narrowly escape an explosion. And we celebrate that tremendously and say, yes, African democracy has matured. I'm afraid it's not the case. If you look at democracies established, you would find out that, yes, there may be skirmishes as you're seeing in the US now, in Trump places and so on, but the system, the economic and political system is not under threat. It's not at risk. So it raises questions of the democratic values of the political elites who are using parties and elections to take over state power and to pursue other goals. And I think this coexistence of high risk of violence and what is seen as stability needs to be probed. I do not think it speaks well for the future. Anything could happen. My second point is that we have also seen that the stability of multi-party politics has also been a time that developmental institutions have been weakened considerably. And I'm reminded about what is happening in South Africa. President Zuma the Supreme Court ruling, ANC's behavior. The Supreme Court says the president has violated the Constitution, the oath he swore. And it is a horrible case of corruption and using public money for private gain, building nice houses and so on. And institutions have done their work, but it's not respected, and they're saying that he did wrong, he violated the Constitution, his own oath. So people are saying, let him go, and so on. And you have the entirety of the ANC machinery taking on those people, shielding the president, and really confusing everybody about what they stand for. What are the values they represent? And they are protecting monumental wrongdoing that in some places would have compelled a step down. The party would have demanded it. So there is this distortion of values. And when it comes from such powerful countries on the continent who seek to lead and lead Africa's democratic development, it raises profound questions. I'm not sure where we are headed, but that is it. Related to this observation is the fact that coming to public office to amass wealth, private wealth, we might call it corruption. Others see it as accumulating capital and becoming rich. And it is really striking that when we thought corrupt authoritarian regimes have seen their day and we're going to have accountability through elections, we are seeing the least enforcement of accountability laws under this so-called spring or rising of electoral democracy in Africa. It is not happening. Kenya is the talk. Parties, governments, and corruption. You get it in Ghana. It's all over the place. And all that people are doing is craving sanctions, prosecution, arrest, something that says the state stands against this because the state is also a moral order. It's not happening. And so it's not only South Africa.